welcome to Tanner's Just Jetz. Welcome back, aviators. This is Tanner speaking, through the voice of Brian, of course. I hope you're excited for today's episode on the S2 Tracker, one of my favorite planes, because of how much of a forgotten underdog she is. And hopefully this episode will get across what I mean by that. But first, just a quick thanks to World of Warbirds and Brian for letting me host this little show now and then on his channel. If you guys are able, please check out and support his Patreon. Two things are sure in life, death and taxes. And although you might not be able to help out with the first one, you certainly can with the second. Let's get into the S2 Tracker, otherwise known as the Stoof. After the end of World War II, the Soviet Union, capturing many documents, scientists, and submarines from the Germans, used this knowledge to begin building their own fleet of subs. And by 1958, they had some 400 of them. So, almost as quickly as the hostilities of World War II ceased, the drama of the Cold War started. And these 400 submarines could be a great way to challenge the United States naval dominance in the region at the time. In February 1955, they launched the first ballistic missile from a Soviet submarine, a naval variant of the R-11, also known as the Scud-A. It had an operational range of hitting a target 180 kilometers or 110 miles away after being launched from the sub. It traveled at speeds up to Mach 5, making it impossible to intercept at the time. Well, what if you could take out the submarine before it could launch the Scud? The AF Guardian was a good platform, but as we learned in the last episode, it obviously had problems. It was big and heavy, making it hard to fly. Not to mention that it operated in a hunter-killer group, meaning to be able to hunt subs, you would need two planes working together. And when these planes are the size of a DC-3, well, those two planes take up a lot of space on an aircraft carrier. Looking to fix these issues, get rid of the unliked Guardian, and keep a strong arm in anti-submarine warfare operations, the US Navy did what it does best. It went shopping. They requested for the first time a purpose-built aircraft. Let's look at a few aircraft that filled the role before. The TBF-TBM bomber was a great anti-submarine platform, especially when operated in hunter-killer groups, like the Guardian. But it performed other roles: dive bombing, recon, torpedo bombing, mine laying, and other jobs. The F-6F Hellcat became an all-weather day or night fighter, and carried out ground attack operations, bomber cover, etc. Well, this new aircraft was designed to be a one-trick pony, anti-submarine only. This started a line for the Navy ordering purpose-built aircraft. A lot of my favorites: the E-2 Hawkeye, A-6 Intruder, the P-3C Orion, and the subject of today's episode. Grumman called it the G-89. And along with being a purpose-built anti-submarine warfare platform, it would feature a large high wing able to fold, featuring twin Wright Cyclone R1820 9-cylinder engines, with a power output of 1,000 horsepower each, unlike the solo prop of the Guardian or Avenger. It would also feature a crew of 4 and a yoke-shaped arrestor hook for landing on aircraft carriers. The Grumman G-89 would later become known as the Grumman S2 Tracker by Grumman, or by its crew nickname of Stoof, because of the aircraft's designation, S2F. Stoof, get it? While Grumman made most of the airframes, 1,185 to be exact, de Havilland Canada would produce one short of 100 for the Royal Canadian Navy, RCN, under the designation CS2F to replace their aging TBM Avengers. Now let's look more closely at the design of the Stoof for the anti-submarine role, and performing both tasks of the hunter and killer at the same time. The two giant R-1820 engines would make it the last piston engine used by the U.S. Navy. Its average cruise speed was about 150 miles per hour, that's 240 kilometers per hour, and would reach overspeed at 280 miles per hour or 450 kilometers per hour at sea level. Of course, for carrier operations, the wings needed to fold to save precious space. During the folding process, the wings folded overhead, unlike what we're used to with the classic Grumman cat stow wing system. It took a lot of hydraulic pressure to shove up the wing sections, 3,000 psi, or pounds per square inch, compared to the standard 1,500 psi used for the aircraft's other hydraulic systems. The folding wing sections are 20 feet long, and when positioned perpendicular to the ground, their tips reach nearly 30 feet high. The left, that's port, section folds behind the right, starboard, and once fully extended, locking pins secure the wings to prevent them from folding during flight. Folding the wings significantly saves space on an aircraft carrier, reducing the wingspan from nearly 70 feet to just 27 feet. At the rear of each engine nacelle would open, showing a honeycomb-shaped loading area for the Jezebel sonobuoy. A sonobuoy is a canister-shaped object that would be dropped from the plane, and wires would deploy from the canister to a decided depth in between 60 feet to 450 feet. The canister wires would listen for sounds of submarines under the water. When listening, this was known as passive sonar. An active sonar buoy would send out pulses, listening for the echo returning from the pulse, bouncing off the side of an enemy submarine. The early S2F carried 16, later versions like the S2F E and G had 32. A central dispenser could carry up to 60 explosive charges that would create pulses that would be heard by the Julie AN-AQA3 detection set. In the mid-50s, a tactic known as explosive echo ranging was invented by the Naval Air Development Center, where they would drop an explosive charge followed by a passive sonobuoy. The idea being that the explosive charge would send a ripple of sound waves through the water, bouncing off the enemy submarine and returning to the passive sonobuoy. And the crew would be able to see a blip on the detection set, showing the relative area of the submarine, making the passive sonar an active sonar. Not having a good name for the project at the time, the researchers from the Naval Air Development Center decided to take a night out in town to think on it. So they visited The Wedge, a nearby burlesque theater in Philadelphia, where their favorite artist, Julie Gibson, took the stage performing her rendition of The Dance of the Bashful Brides. Being impressed, the naval researchers decided on the name Project Julie. Why? Because Julie made passive buoys go active. The combination of explosive charges, sonobuoy, and the AQA3 detection set became known as Julie Jezebel. The name for the sonobuoy becoming known as Jezebel, likely named after Queen Jezebel of Israel, known as a betrayer of her people, like how the passive sonar would listen for and betray the location of submarines. Along with the S2 Tracker having engine nacelle bays for sonobuoys to find the enemy submarines, it had an internal bomb bay, mainly made for carrying 2 torpedoes, or a single nuclear depth charge. The nuclear depth charge was designed with the goal of, instead of finding the area of the sub, then taking out the sub, you would just find the area of the sub and take out the whole area with a single depth charge, carrying a Mark 7 nuclear warhead capable of a yield of 32 kilotons. Later variants of the tracker could even carry the AGM-12 Bullpup, a guided air-to-ground missile. With this missile, a target could be locked onto and then the weapons systems officer could use a joystick to vary changes in the flight path of the missile to meet variation changes of the target it's tracking. There are different warheads that can be attached to the AGM-12, including semi-armor piercing, nuclear, and cluster. Its explosive mass can be related to a general-purpose 250-pound bomb, or 22 kilograms, but altogether the actual missile would weigh a whopping 1,785 pounds, or 810 kilograms, to include all of its tech and the flight body. Along with being able to carry the 2 torpedoes inside its torpedo bay, the Stoof had 6 hardpoints that could be armed with rockets, rocket pods, Mark 54 depth charges, or 4 more torpedoes. Further out on the wing was the AN/AVQ-2A Searchlight, a powerful light with 70 million candlelight power. It was later replaced by an 85 million candlelight power for searching for subs or illuminating for other aircraft. A control switch box for the light was fixed near the co-pilot's seat for its use. If this switch failed, one sat inside the cockpit, behind the co-pilot's seat. The earlier mentioned sonobuoys were operated by the man sitting directly behind the cockpit, who is called the radar sonobuoy operator. But we will call him sonar operator for short. And yes, this plane was also fitted with an MAD, magnetic anomaly detector, that would be able to detect changes in magnetic fields like a large submarine. The large clump of ferromagnetic materials, like iron, would theoretically be picked up. Another man operating this position would be sitting directly behind the pilot's seat and to the left of the sonar operator, who was called the MAD-CM operator. But we will call him the MAD, or Magnetic Anomaly Detector, operator. If an engine was ever to go out during flight, the pilot could rely on the hydraulically operated rudder trimmer to apply enough isometric power to offset the lost engine. Being an anti-sub, twin-prop platform, the plane was fit comfortably for the crew to handle long flights, featuring autopilot, altitude control, and a heated cockpit. The heat was also pushed to the torpedo bay to make sure that the cold wouldn't interfere with possibly vital operations inside. Not to mention, this plane, being designed in the 1950s, also came with ashtray boxes for each crew member, which were later welded shut when the FAA banned smoking in the 1980s. Hose-shaped tubes for emptying the bladder were supplied in the cockpit. If you look directly behind the pilot and co-pilot and directly on the back of the cockpit bulkhead or cockpit wall in front of the MAD and sonar operators, there are little khaki or olive green bags for storing your communication headphones, microphones, and canteens. You can't tell me that this plane is not luxurious. You can enter an S2 Tracker, ask for permission first if this said tracker is not your own, by opening an oval-shaped door with a porthole on the right side of the plane under the wing. Inside is a ladder that can be fitted into holes in the plane to allow access. You would step up into the body of the plane, and from here is a large step leading to the sonar and magnetic anomaly detector operator positions. These 2 chairs facing towards the front of the plane, with big sets of avionics in front of them. If you take about 3 more steps while watching your head so you don't bump it, you can enter the cockpit area. It feels like a whole different part of the plane, with all the windows from the exit hatches on top, windows on either side of the pilot, and the large main cockpit window going across the pilot's and co-pilot's station, going right across the front of the plane, just separated by a small mid-trim line. To explain it simply, the cockpit feels like a greenhouse. I couldn't imagine the amazing feeling of all that vitamin D you'd be getting on the flight deck, waiting to launch with the engines roaring. In the case of an emergency, 2 exit hatch windows are above and just barely behind the pilot and co-pilot, as mentioned a few seconds ago. For the magnetic anomaly detector operator and sonar operator, they would climb down the steps and jettison the door they came in from. Yes, this plane did not have ejection seats. Just like my previous Grumman Guardian episode. The early Stoof had an ESM, Electronic Support Measures Pod, mounted on top of the plane just behind the pilot's seat, next to a bail hatch. This would detect radar transmissions sent by ships and land bases, and attached to the pod on the early tracker was the sniffer, a smoke particle detector. So, a fire alarm, you may ask? What's the purpose of that? Wouldn't they just see the planes on fire? Diesel-electric submarines had a system called a submarine schnorkel. This would allow the sub to travel submerged while taking in oxygen and charging its electric batteries by running on the diesel engines and raising a device from the submarine that would work like a diver's schnorkel. The disadvantages of this were, 1. You could not use the hydrophones to listen to your surroundings, as all you would hear would be the hum of your own diesel engines. 2. You couldn't travel faster than 6 knots without the risk of damaging the schnorkel. 3. And the biggest effect would be the clouds of black gas coming up from the engines. Putting diesel exhaust smoke particles in the air that would be picked up, yes, by the sniffer. On the later models, the sniffer ESM pod was removed and replaced with a much smaller and streamlined wingtip ESM pod. On the 30th of June 1950, the U.S. Navy ordered 2 prototypes, the S2F1 and 15 production variants of the Stoof. The first flight of the prototypes was conducted just 2 years later on December 4th, 1952, and the first production Stoofs entered service in February 1954 with VS-26. It was a successful design, loved by pilots, maintenance crews, and all alike. The tracker would serve 22 years of service in the United States Navy, in both East and West Coast squadrons. 8 squadrons would operate the S2 Tracker in Vietnam. On January 21st, 1966, S2D Tracker, serial number 149242, was sitting on the deck of the USS Hornet CV-8. The deck crew hooked her up, the catapult connected to the small hook in front of the aircraft, and she started up her engines. The day's crew consisted of Seaman Apprentice Russell Sennett, Seaman Edmund Frenier, and pilots Lieutenant Bernard Templin and Lieutenant Standard Foreman. The tracker launched from the carrier like a primed-up rocket sled. The crew felt a big lurch as they're thrown off the carrier at a speed possible of achieving flight. It's possible they were not expecting too much that day. Stoofs were not exactly the front-line fighters like the F-4 Phantom, or low-flying penetration bombers like the A-6, or the workhorse forward air controllers called Misties, or the Sandy Sky Raider. She had her own role, patrolling the coasts, and while you usually imagine troops in the jungle when it comes to Vietnam, remember, the whole thing debatedly started because of enemy contact in the Gulf, and not with troops pushing through branches and bushes. Today they were assigned to cover the area for the United States destroyers close to the North Vietnamese coastline on search and rescue missions. An unspecified amount of time later, the USS Berkeley, a guided missile destroyer, contacted Tracker 149252 and started relaying the position for an unidentified radar contact. It wasn't uncommon for North Vietnamese patrol boats and their fake fishing boats to harass the search and rescue destroyers. A short while later, Berkeley lost contact with the tracker, and all further attempts to contact her were fruitless. A few hours later, Hanoi Hana announced on the radio that a U.S. aircraft had been shot down in the Gulf of Tonkin, to the south of Bac Long V Island. A major search operation was carried out, but the only artifacts found from the plane was an empty, deployed life raft that matched the type that they had on board, and Lieutenant Templin's flight helmet. No other signs of the crew were found, and they were all declared dead in 1975. May they rest in peace. So loved was the Stoof that she would later come to have a brother and sister in the E-1 Tracer and C-1 Trader. If you know Navy airplanes like me, you'll know that the aircraft operated right now are very similar, but just add one. The E-2C Hawkeye and C-2 Greyhound. The E-1 Tracer, or cutely referred to as the Stoof with a Roof, or Willie Fudd, was the Navy's first purpose-built airborne early warning aircraft. It was the shining light of the future of air warfare. Featuring the Hazeltine AN/APS-82 radar inside a large dish on top of the aircraft. Using reflected radar energy, it can distinguish the position and speed of aircraft within a range of 200 nautical miles. The C2 Trader's role is the unseen workhorse, the one that doesn't get enough attention, but without it, carrier operations would be extremely limited. It carried cargo and crew to and from the ship, with seating for 9 persons or 3,500 pounds of cargo. It carried cargo, crew, and mail to the aircraft carriers operating in the Vietnam War. 87 traders were built, with 4 being turned into the EC-1A, an electronic warfare version of the Stoof. The C-1 Trader was retired from U.S. naval service in 1988, the second to last radial engine plane in the Navy. Looking very similar to the Stoof, the easiest way to tell them apart is that the cargo variant has porthole windows on the side, while the original Stoof does not. The S2F Tracker usually would be deployed on Essex-class carriers, purely designated to the anti-submarine warfare role. When dedicated, the carrier would have 2 fixed-wing ASW squadrons operating the Stoof, a rotary wing squadron, or 2 operating the SH-34G Seabat, an early warning squadron of E-1 Tracers, the Willie Fudd, and sometimes a squadron A-4 Skyhawk for defensive capabilities. Their main role was to track Soviet submarines, but at times they assisted NASA in spacecraft launches as a recovery ship. The Stoof would rack up 6 million flight hours. Perhaps the most amazing fact of this aircraft at all is that for every 10,000 of these hours, there was an overall mishap rate of 0.69 in its lifetime. So far, the F-16 Fighting Falcon, one of the most exported jets across the world, is at 0.79 per every 10,000 flight hour. And she achieved almost 750,000 traps, or landings aboard aircraft carriers, or deserved to be the first aircraft launches by steam catapult upon the USS Hancock. When not tracking Soviet submarines in the 32 years it did, including the Cuban Missile Crisis, Stoofs back at land bases made their pay. They were flown for proficiency testing, towing aerial targets, and hauled whatever the Navy put in them. While a very impressive career with the U.S. Navy, they weren't the only country to operate the Stoof. This part is for our 24 Argentinian fans out there. In 1962, Argentina ordered their first Stoofs, 6 S2A Trackers, creating Argentina's Escuadrilla Aeronaval Antisubmarina, or the Naval Aviation Anti-Submarine Squadron, and they served on formerly Britain's HMS Warrior, V1, now known as ARA Independencia, yep, the same one from the Cougar Panther episodes, until it was retired 6 years later and replaced by V2, ARA 25 de Mayo, originally HMS Venerable. 10 years later, the planes were starting to show their age, so Argentina negotiated to replace the 6 S2As with 2 new S2Es, which were based out of Aeronaval Comandante Espora in Bahia Blanca, Buenos Aires, with the final aircraft being delivered by Grumman in early December of 1978. Right away they embarked on the 25 de Mayo to stage for the Beagle conflict. This was a land dispute over the islands of Picton, Lennox, and Nueva. These islands were right at the southern tip of South America, right where the end of Argentina meets the end of Chile, leading to a fair dispute over the land rights and maritime jurisdiction. Arguments got so heated, it was right on the brink of war. Thankfully, things got resolved peacefully. Just 4 years later, 3 of Argentina's earlier S2A variants were sent to Ban Rio Grande in Tierra del Fuego. In the early morning hours of April 5th, 1982, a British fleet would approach the Falklands territory to take back their land that was captured 3 days earlier by the Argentinian military. Before reaching land, one of those S2 trackers would find and relay the location of the British fleet, launching a strike package of 5 A4 scooters from the 25 to attack the ships, bombing the Royal Fleet arms Sir Galahad and Sir Tristan, killing 50 sailors and injuring another 159 more. For the rest of the conflict, they carried out fleet patrols from both land and the carrier. In 1988, 25 would go out of commission for repairs, but this would end up being the end of her, as just 11 years later of sitting in the dry dock, she would be sold for scrap. Still looking for the chance to practice carrier operations, in March 1990, 2 of the S2 trackers would perform touch-and-goes on the U.S. Navy's USS Constellation, CV-64. Argentinian trackers would also land on the USS Kitty Hawk and USS Abraham Lincoln. Yes, the one that they used in Top Gun Maverick. While Argentina is the only nation that continues to operate it, there are other nations that flew the Stoof militarily but have since retired her, including Australia, Brazil, Italy, Japan, the Netherlands, Peru, South Korea, Taiwan, Thailand, Turkey, and finally, Venezuela. Phew, take a breath, Brian. Nice job. Hey, she writes it, I just read it. Just like our previous plane, the Guardian, this babe went on to fight more than submarines. KLM, Royal Dutch Airlines, uses their Navy's old retired trackers to train aviation mechanics. But most importantly, they would replace aging B-17s and A-26s, and from our earlier episode in this series covering the F-Guardian, in performing the role of aerial firefighting. Conair Group, a Canadian aviation company specializing in refitting firefighting planes, acquired 82 S2 Tracker airframes from the Canadian and US Navies to convert into a Firecat. Being a Grumman plane, Conair only saw it right to give it a proper Grumman Cat name, and this one was also fitting its purpose. After the conversion to a firefighting plane, the Firecat was able to carry 897 gallons, that's 3,395 liters of water, or 47 gallons, 173 liters of fire-retardant foam. Some were fitted with turboprops, becoming known as Turbo Firecats. They have a larger fuel tank and also carry external fuel pods. In fact, if you saw any of the videos of the Los Angeles firefighting planes this year, you've probably seen a tracker. In the United States, they serve with the California Department of Forestry and Fire Protection. Aero Union, a firefighting aircraft company in California, being the first to operate them in the state. And Hemet Flying Company, also based in California. Marsh Aviation Arizona also makes a variant of the Firecat known as the Marsh Turbo Tracker, another turboprop derivative of a firefighting S2 tracker. In Canada, the Saskatchewan Ministry of the Environment operates 7 Firecats, and the Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources operated 6, which were later sold. Sécurité Civile in France uses both conventional and turbo Firecats. Now, since this is our first time talking about turboprops on this channel, and possibly not the last, I'm going to give it a really good coverage here. Sorry if I lose you guys somewhere. So, let's review what we already know. Many older prop planes have their propeller turned by a reciprocating engine, while jets take in air from the front, squeeze it with a compressor turbine, add fuel, and burn it, and blow it through a power turbine that is also shafted to the compressor turbine in the front. But, in simpler words, a turboprop is an aircraft with a mixed power source, consisting of a propeller, powered by a jet-like engine compressing the air. Now I'm going to do my best to get into the specifics. Imagine this. As you fly your turboprop aircraft through the sky, air gets swooshed into an air intake under the propeller, which is an aerodynamically shaped hole. The air flows in and goes aft through ducting, hitting the rear area behind the engine, which is known as a firewall. because it's a wall that stops engine fires from burning into the wings or the cockpit and the pilot's face. So the air hits the firewall and the ducting forces it to make a 180-degree U-turn in the direction of flight, where it gets sucked into the jet engine and does another 180-degree turn. Here it gets sucked into the compressor stage of the engine, as I explained earlier. These actions are called reverse airflow. During the compression stage of the engine, the air gets sucked in through a series of spinning blades going from bigger to smaller. All the while, the blades compress the air tighter and tighter. In between each of these spinning blades are others that don't move at all. These are called vanes or stators, and these non-moving blades convert the power of the air getting spun through these blades into energy inside that air. After the air has been compressed and energized, it gets blown out of the compressor stage and into the combustion chamber. Here, some of the air is mixed with fuel and ignited, while the rest is sucked through inlets in the chamber, allowing the fire to heat it up. That heated air then makes its way into the compressor turbine. The compressor turbine is much like the compression stage earlier mentioned, with a circular set of blades that the air passes through, and as it passes through these blades, the now hot, powerful air turns them fast in a circle like a windmill from hell, spinning at 37,000 RPM. But don't get confused. This first turbine doesn't spin the propeller. It is just shafted to the compressor that started the process in the first place. Just forward of the compressor turbine are two power turbines in the second engine stage. They also spin, like the earlier mentioned compressor turbine, as the hot air flows through them. One power turbine is shafted to the engine-driven accessories in the aircraft, like the fuel and oil pumps, the generator, and the starter. And the other power turbine is connected to the propeller, providing the spin power to turn that. Now, there's no way a propeller in front could spin at 37,000 RPM because the tips would be going supersonic and not moving the air efficiently. So there's a system installed called a reduction gearbox. It reduces the rotations of the propeller to a maximum of a manageable few thousand RPM. This gearbox and the power turbine work together to spin the prop, creating thrust and push our turboprop through the air. Sorry guys if that's confusing, but I did my best. If you want to see some of these beasts, you're in luck. There are many surviving Stoofs out there all over the world, in countries where she was previously operated. To see an original variant, the S2A, you can visit the Southern Museum of Flight in Birmingham, Alabama. There is also one at the Argentine Naval Aviation Museum in Bahia Blanca, Argentina. Tracker 05106 AG52. To see an S2F, you can visit Legacy Flight Museum in Rexburg, Ohio for Bureau number 136719. 148730 is at NAS Jacksonville Heritage Park at Aviation Air Station, Jacksonville, Florida. In Princeton, Minnesota, at Flight Expo, they have one currently being restored. That one can be visited and donated to. For a Canadian Stoof, you're going to want to visit the Canadian Air and Space Museum in Ottawa, Canada, to see Tracker 1600. Of course, there's going to be one at the National Naval Aviation Museum in Pensacola, Florida. This being Bureau number 151647, an S2F 3S Tracker. I hope I got the point across. I don't know how many of you have heard of the Grumman Tracker before today, but if today is your first day of hearing of this marvelous bird, don't forget her. Keep your eyes open the next time you walk into an air museum, and you might just see one of these lumbering beauties. Thanks guys for listening. I hope to see you guys next time. Remember, there's always more to this sport we call flying.